Hi, I'm Taylor Owen. From the Globe and Mail, this is Machines Like Us. When the American company OpenAI released ChatGPT, it was, for a lot of us, the first time we'd interacted with generative AI. The chatbot has become so wildly popular that in some ways it's now synonymous with artificial intelligence. But that may be changing. Earlier this year, a Chinese startup called DeepSeek launched its own AI chatbot, sending shockwaves across Silicon Valley. According to DeepSeek, the model they've built is just as powerful as ChatGPT, but it was developed at a fraction of the cost. In other words, this isn't just a new company. It could be an entirely different approach to building artificial intelligence. It's fair to say that DeepSeek shook the AI industry. But a month has passed since they launched their first model, and so I thought it might be a good time to try and figure out just how significant this actually was. To do that, I wanted to speak with Karen Howe. Howe was the first reporter to ever write a profile of OpenAI, and has covered AI for the MIT Tech Review, The Atlantic, and The Wall Street Journal. And she's currently based in Hong Kong. So she's better positioned than almost anyone to try and make sense of this seemingly monumental shift in the landscape of artificial intelligence. So just first off here, why did the release of DeepSeek R1, their first model, trigger such a frenzy in the AI world that you cover?
To really understand the reaction of the AI world, you kind of have to understand the mind frame that the AI world was in for the last few years before DeepSeek arrived. So you mentioned that OpenAI was the way that a lot of the world was introduced to generative AI. And really, that was true of the public. That was also true of a lot of people within the tech industry. Not everyone in tech worked in AI. Nowadays, that basically
is that possible?
That's changed.
Yeah.
Right. But before, a lot of people within tech also, ChatGPT was sort of their first real taste of AI. And a lot of the norms or a lot of the things that OpenAI did, a lot of the choices that they made in developing ChatGPT then became the norm. And what happened in the last 3 to 4 years is what has really become a dogma around AI is that bigger is better. If you just scale these AI models to an enormous size, you pour in all of the internet's data, you use these absolutely massive supercomputers to train them, that is the way to get to more advanced capabilities. And the reason why DeepSeek freaked a lot of people out is because it basically showed that that's not true. And in fact, a lot of people who had been doing AI research for a long time actually knew that to be the case. But because so many people in the tech world, so many people in the public kind of came online with ChatGPT as their first real interaction, I think they just assumed this to be fact. And so it really shook the core of people that had no other, imagination of what it could be like to develop AI.
So I want to talk a little bit about why that became the norm. So how scaling and growth and massive models became the thing that DeepSeek ended up sort of disrupting in a sense. So what was OpenAI in its origin? Why was it built and what was its core purpose?
Yeah, so OpenAI was originally founded as a nonprofit. The two main players that came together to found it were Sam Altman, now the current CEO, as well as Elon Musk. And the reason they co-founded it at the time, at least they say, that it was supposed to be the antithesis of Google, because at the time, Google was really starting to snap up a lot of the most talented AI researchers in the world and starting to really develop a concentration of AI research within the company. And Musk was very concerned that this was going to overly constrain AI development to for-profit motives. And that was ultimately not going to be good for the world because AI is such a consequential technology. It's going to affect so many people. And not only would being within Google constrain the development in this way, it could also make AI a lot more closed source. So people don't really understand anymore how is AI being developed. So OpenAI was meant to be the opposite. It was supposed to be open source, hence the name OpenAI, and also a nonprofit not motivated at all by commercial endeavors. What essentially happened over the course of OpenAI's history is that they completely did a 180 on this premise.
Both of them, right? On both being open and nonprofit.
On both of them, yeah. So they're now very closed, and actually, in fact, far more closed than any company was before. And they actually shifted the entire industry to be far more closed than ever before. And they're also now, I mean, technically, they're still a nonprofit that exists, but it's nonprofit in name only. They are one of the most aggressive commercial endeavors in Silicon Valley. The thing that made this switch was this particular decision that they made where they thought we cannot compete with Google on fundamental breakthroughs because Google had a really high concentration of talent. They had a stellar team, but not nearly as many people, and they were trying to figure out what is the game that we can win. And one of the things that they decided early on was, well, we can take existing innovations and just make them bigger.
What were the existing innovations of the time?
Yeah. So the innovation that they ended up picking was an algorithm or a neural network that had been designed by Google called the Transformer. And Google had designed this because it was a really good way to process language. And Google has a lot of language-based services. Google Search runs on language. Google Translate runs on language. Email runs on language. And they thought if we can just have a better language AI technology, then we will be able to better target users with ads and search results and get more accurate translations and just overall improve the quality of our services and the monetizability of them. And what OpenAI thought was, this language technology could actually be used to do more than what Google has been using it for. Google has been using it to process language. We want to use it to generate language and create a generative AI model. And so they took that innovation, the Transformer, they pumped far more data into it and started training it with a lot more as the way to beat Google at its game by changing the game towards one more of scale and engineering rather than one of fundamental research and breakthroughs. And so ultimately, that was what set OpenAI on this path of, wait a minute, that means we need way more money. A nonprofit's not going to work. We need to change into a for-profit to get more money.
To capitalize the scaling or the resources needed to scale.
Exactly, to resource the scaling.
And what are the components of that scaling? So it's more data, but is it also more training and more, what else goes into that scaling?
Yeah, so it's two ingredients. It's more data and more compute. And compute is the industry term that refers to how big your computer is that you're actually training and also running the AI model on. Once you develop the model, you're giving it to users. Every time someone uses ChatGPT, they also need server space to deliver that model to you. And so before, most AI models were being trained at the size of something that could run on like a powerful laptop.
So even like the models Google were working on at the time.
Probably they needed something slightly bigger, but a lot of the research...
Right, but they didn't use the massive compute capacity that the current models need.
Exactly. Everything was much smaller and much more optimized because, Google is serving this to billions of users. They're trying to get these things as small and cost efficient as possible. And now, because of what OpenAI did, we use supercomputers to train these generative AI models. And these supercomputers can be hundreds of, American football fields large, one of them. And that is just an extraordinarily insane progression from like what we did before to what we do now.
It's insane, but it's a progression that I think I've seen you argue is based more in business than science. Is that true? Like, how did the financial model here drive that path?
Right. It's interesting because when I say business, I don't necessarily mean that this is a financially sound business by any means, but it is being driven by this potential for it to be lucrative and not science. What I mean by that is there's no physics principle that says that we need to blow up these computers to hundreds of football fields large in order to create something that is going to, act like ChatGPT. There's actually a lot of different ways that we could have gotten there. We could have also just decided not to build a chatbot. Like a chatbot is also a very particular type of AI. Do we need a chatbot versus
This is the thing we
Yeah.
now think is AI is wild, right?
Yeah, which I mean, like the public has been primed for decades by Hollywood that like AI will one day be like thing that talks to you. And before ChatGPT arrived, AI was doing plenty of useful things that was just in the background. Like things like your email spam filter is AI, and that does wonders for improving like the quality of everyone's life every day. But OpenAI made these two key decisions that they really wanted something that would interact with users in a way that was really kind of persuasive and just felt really magical. So they went for the chatbot, and they also thought, let's go for something where we just know how, like there's this formula that we know that gets results, which is we just feed more stuff into it, and let's just exploit that formula rather than continue to do research that might find a different way around it, because research is difficult, it's unpredictable. You can invest a lot into doing research and not have results. So it's just safer to do the thing that you know. Bigger is better, bigger is better. And that's how we got to where we are today.
You'd been covering AI as a beat for a while before that, and there aren't a ton of people who had. I mean, I'm curious how you reacted to that.
Yes. I've been covering AI since 2018, and honestly, I reacted to it just feeling really disappointed because, there was so much interesting research that was happening in 2018. And like so many fascinating ideas that people were exploring, whether they were in the corporate labs or in academic labs. I was reading about papers where scientists were tweaking things about neural networks that would make them train on almost no data. Like there were some like wild, wacky experiments that were happening at the time, and it just really felt like that. One, everyone suddenly forgot that those other experiments and approaches existed. And two, everyone went from academic labs to corporate labs. So like all of the experts stopped being independent experts. Like they were all now suddenly tied at the hip to some kind of company. And therefore their research, even if they did remember, previous things that they were doing, it was all in service now of the corporate agenda.
And fast forward a couple of years, I guess, from that moment, and on the second day of Trump 2, we get the announcement of Stargate. So what was that? And does that just confirm that we were all in on this scaling approach as an industry?
Yeah, so Stargate is this initiative that President Trump announced where there will be $500 billion of private investment going into building AI computing infrastructure in the US. And what OpenAI then said during its announcement, mirroring it, is that all of that computing infrastructure is supposed to be for OpenAI. And the three main partners are OpenAI, SoftBank, and then Oracle. And really what that was, it was two things. One is it was demonstrating once again that how far this bigger is better scaling dogma has gone, where we are like $500 billion is an insane quantity of money for anything, but also for data centers. So that's more money than was ever spent on the Apollo program to send the first man to the moon. And it is like,
that's remarkable.
Yeah, no,
it's incredible.
It's literally if we actually spend that much money on data centers, it will be the largest infrastructure build out in the history of humanity. And in service of what? It's like we're still not really sure.
Speculative use cases for a certain kind of AI.
And the other thing is, like, today, an incredibly expensive data center is like $1 billion. So what, like, $500 billion is like Like, where are we building like 500 of these? And where are we going to get the energy to serve them? Like, where are we going to get the water to cool them? There are already so many issues around that we're seeing with existing data centers, especially the ones that are being built at the size to train, to develop AI models. But the other thing that I think was interesting about the Stargate initiative was it really does show also the way that OpenAI and Sam Altman works, which is that, like, this is a private investment. It really doesn't have much to do with the US government. But by getting President Trump to announce it, it essentially hitches the scaling dogma to the legacy of the US president.
Or the power of the American state.
Yeah. So they get the full backing of President Trump behind ultimately what will be an incredibly land-intensive and energy-intensive endeavor. And so it allows them basically a clean, like no obstacles to try and do this, at least from a pure regulatory environment perspective. Like they still have plenty of obstacles in getting the $500 billion, but...
Is it a real thing? Was it just a press release, or is it a real initiative, do you think?
It is a real initiative, but do they have the full $500 billion? It's been heavily debated whether or not they do, and whether or not they can actually, even if they have that much money, whether they could deploy it within Trump's term, which is what they said, they would do it in 4 years, is also highly debated because data centers take a really long time to build. And you're not talking just about tapping into existing energy infrastructure. You're talking about building new energy plants as well. And that takes even longer to build. You need a lot of, safety testing. You need to scope out the environment, create an environmental impact assessment, all of these different processes. And they're basically trying to skip over a lot of these processes to try and meet their timeline.
So we get the emergence of this scaling model. The industry is all following a similar path. We get a massive historic investment in that very model, backed in some way anyway by the American government and the president. And then moments later, DeepSeek emerges. So what does it do differently than that scaling model?
So I don't want to make it out to be that like DeepSeek did everything fundamentally differently. They actually did a lot of things the same. So they're still going for the generative AI approach. They're still going for a chatbot-like approach, and they still train on lots of data. So these are all things that they that they held constant. But the thing that's happened in the last few years between the US and China is that the US government, as advised by American AI companies, decided that the key way to limit AI progress in China is to go after the chips, go after the compute. Because if scaling laws is a thing, if scaling is the only way to go to more and better AI capabilities, then you can really kneecap the ability of another country or another organization, whatever it is, to make that progress by just constraining their computational resources. So the US Commerce Department in 2022 started a very kind of aggressive strategy to limit the export of American-designed chips to China, specifically NVIDIA chips. And what happened is essentially then companies like DeepSeek, they had to work with what they had.
Can I pause you on that for 1 second? What's the difference between a lower quality and higher quality chip in how it is needed for that model of AI training?
Yeah, so the best chips in the world for AI development, or I should say the most commonly used chips for AI development, NVIDIA chips, they excel at a particular thing, which is doing lots of calculations in parallel. And a lower quality chip just means that it can process fewer calculations per unit of time, like per second, per millisecond, whatever it is. Yeah, so the US government had really capped the number of calculations that chips exported to China can perform. And so essentially, like, if it were true that you can only get more advancements from in AI from just better chips, that means like essentially Chinese companies would just have to run these chips for far longer in order to perform the same number of calculations, because it's the rate of calculations that is important. Like an American company might be able to do something within 3 months, and then a Chinese company has to do it within like a year or something like that. And so they were trying to delay the ability of Chinese companies to reach American companies by dragging out the amount of time that it takes.
And so how did they get around this?
Yeah, so essentially what DeepSeek did was they just looked in the literature, of what researchers had been doing before, and there were all of these different techniques that had just been like forgotten. There's this thing called mixture of experts, where you take an AI model, and when you're talking with ChatGPT, with every question, there's like a very particular topic that you might want to talk about. Like one day you might be talking about horses, and the next day you're talking about like playing chess. And those are like really not related. And so there had been this technique developed where you could route a person's question to a particular part of the AI model, such that only the part of the AI model that's like relevant to the person's question lights up and does stuff. And so that also significantly reduces the energy and training intensity of a model, because you are not training one giant model to do everything. You're actually breaking it up into more efficient units and training each one on things, different specialties. So they did that. Anyway, they ended up doing around 6 to 8 different things that had been techniques that had been developed before, but had just never really been implemented at scale and had never been combined like this before. They did an incredible engineering feat in doing that. And that's how they ultimately were able to then dramatically reduce the amount of compute that they needed.
And give an indication of the scale of that reduction of compute and the cost savings, and because it's dramatic.
It's really dramatic. I mean, there's a lot of debate about like exactly the numbers that they've given, exactly whether or not they're precise. But this is orders of magnitude. Like in American companies today, like at OpenAI, they probably spend tens of billions of dollars developing a model, and DeepSeek likely spent tens of millions of dollars developing this model. So it could be potentially 3 orders of magnitude more efficient.
Do you think we can take DeepSeek's claims at face value here? Like, to what degree do we trust this?
So I don't think we should ever take any company's claims at face value. But the thing about DeepSeek open sourcing things is that there has been a lot of testing on their claims since then to see like whether or not they hold up to independent evaluation. It is hard to evaluate the cost that something was developed at, because it would require someone to try to replicate the full chain of development, and even though it was like ultra efficient compared to the current paradigm, it was still like tens of millions of dollars, and not everyone has that kind of cash lying around. But that said, like all of their claims on like the performance and things like that, those have now all been independently validated, and people like researchers who have to a certain extent replicated some aspects of the DeepSeek model have mentioned that it does seem right that they trained it that cheaply.
So what did you think when you first saw this? Did you think it was as big a deal as everyone was making it out to be? Like, what was your reaction here?
A lot of people were reacting to like, this says everything about the US versus China, race and whatever. And I was like, guys, it doesn't matter if this is a Chinese company or not a Chinese company. Just like a company or like a group of researchers just proved that this dogma around scaling is just totally not true. And that is the far more important lesson to take here, because we are at a point where the development of these generative AI systems is wreaking havoc on our planet. It is setting us back dramatically in our climate change goals. It is having huge strain on fresh water resources. Like this is like not a joke. And The thing that we need to learn from the DeepSeek approach is not necessarily that everyone suddenly do the DeepSeek approach. That's not what I'm saying by any means. But that there's literally alternative. If you just spend a little bit more time thinking about it like they did, we could dramatically reduce the environmental impact of developing these technologies without necessarily sacrificing performance. Like that was the thing that like a lot of people that were harping already for a while on like the environmental impact of AI, like the counter argument was, oh, but then we're going to have to shortchange like the technologies that we have access to.
And think of all the progress we'd miss out on.
Yeah, exactly. Think of all the progress that we'd miss out on, and which I still think is a wild argument. Like, who cares about progress when we don't have a planet anymore? But you know, like DeepSeek showed that you actually don't even have to make this trade-off. You could get progress and also not destroy the planet in the process. So that means there's a lot of other techniques out there, a lot more research that can be done to find more methods like this. And then we can get to a place which is ultimately real progress, like actual true progress in the sense of the word.
It's striking that this innovative, efficient model was developed in a state-centric communist economy. And the supposedly nimble US capitalist economy created this bloated, resource-intensive form of AI.
Yeah, I mean, there's sort of, I guess, two thoughts that I have on that. One is that sometimes you need to look at like the local innovation environment rather than the national one to really understand what happened. And for DeepSeek, what is quite interesting is the company itself was organized to be very similar to a Silicon Valley startup. It was organized to be very flat in structure, where there was a lot of bottoms-up innovation that was happening. And so that's ultimately how the company then arrived at this ultra-efficient model. Was there were all these different groups of researchers within the organization that were each working on their different projects, and then they kind of like merged into something collectively. And that is actually, you know, how OpenAI used to work as like a nonprofit. That was what they did, and how Google used to work. But the other thing with like American companies that has happened in the last few years is because the resource intensive nature of what they're choosing to do is so high, they've actually organized themselves to be much more centralized. So Google, for example, they used to have this bottoms-up innovation approach where different groups would get like a pool of compute resources, and they would go do their research, and then they would report back, and then eventually the best ideas would bubble up to the top. But when you're trying to train things with tens of thousands of chips, maybe even hundreds of thousands of chips, you can't divvy it up across like lots of different people doing bottoms-up research anymore. So all of the companies in the US changed to, we at the top are going to dictate the direction, and we will decide this is the thing that we're going to throw like hundreds of thousands of chips at.
And it's all hands on deck in this one direction.
In this one direction. And so if you look at the country, like the national level, you might actually miss this bigger, the kind of like micro difference, which is that it was far more centralized in the US and far more distributed innovation in DeepSeek. And that's part of the reason why, you know, some people have pointed out that DeepSeek might not be that replicable in China, and that like there aren't really that other companies that are kind of doing that approach. Maybe actually Chinese companies will shift to that approach now that they've seen it bear fruit. But it is, yeah, like at the micro level, there was literally a flip in how innovation was being done at the ground level.
Can you say a little bit more about what this has done to the Chinese tech industry broadly? Is this sort of, what's the reaction been in the Chinese tech to this?
I think there's been an enormous amount of pride, because not only was DeepSeek able to do something that a lot of people outside of China and within China thought was not really possible, but DeepSeek also gave it out to everyone for free. And so a lot of Chinese tech companies have now integrated DeepSeek into their products completely for free. And,
oh, wow.
And so there is this sort of like pride of this was Chinese made and also like given to the public as like a benefit for the good, which is what OpenAI originally, you know, founded itself to do.
The ironies in this are just all the way through, right? From start to finish in this story. It's really something.
Yeah. And it's not just that they gave it for free to Chinese companies, right? They gave it for free to the entire world. So there are American companies that are also using DeepSeek now, like Perplexity, which is a startup based in the US that's trying to create an AI search engine. They're also serving up DeepSeek now. And also there are so many open source developers all around the world that are also starting to build off of DeepSeek or even create variations of DeepSeek, because one of the things about DeepSeek is it was developed to be compliant with Chinese censorship laws, but it's very easy to modify it since it's completely free and in the world. So there are lots of developers that have just modified it to now like not be censored, essentially.
So there's been a lot of concern obviously raised around the Chinese origins and the connection to the possible state connections here. Do you share any of these?
I mean, I think it would be a concern if it had not opened up its model such that anyone could use it, in the sense that then, if everyone had to use DeepSeek and have their data run through DeepSeek servers and they had to comply with Chinese censorship law, then yes, I think that would be a concern for people that are not living in China to be complying with Chinese censorship law. I have friends that are running DeepSeek on their local laptops. It's not connected to any server. It's not connected. They're not.
Just to be clear, that means data that they're inputting aren't going back in any way to
exactly
servers in China.
Yeah. It's staying on their computer. And they're downloading versions of the model that have already had the censorship taken out. So from that perspective, I don't see why there is concern, in the sense that it's completely adaptable. It can be completely local, and in fact is in that sense better than any other product where you have to run your data through server. Like, I don't like running my personal data through OpenAI servers. So like actually having a model where I can just run it completely locally is better than that.
Let alone using a social media platform or anything else that sucks up our data, right?
Right, so. Exactly.
Are there concerns in the US government that you're hearing, or are there people talking about bans like TikTok? How are you hearing about the national security discourse coalescing around this?
I think there's like a debate happening around like, did the US chip export controls limiting the types of chips that can get exported to China, did that inadvertently create the conditions for something like DeepSeek? And there's a lot of like soul searching happening right now, where some people are saying absolutely yes, and some people are saying absolutely no. And there's really not a lot of clarity, honestly, on like which one's going to win out and how that's going to inform the way that the US government moves forward, potentially continuing down this strategy. I've seen bubbling up of discussions of bans, but the issue is that you can't really ban something that's open unless, the US did what China did, which is like create an entire firewall around the country and start deciding, like what's allowed to enter the firewall versus not.
I mean, I could suppose you could ban the DeepSeek app.
Right. Yeah. Right. So I think there have already been some government agencies, I believe, that have banned their government staff from downloading the DeepSeek app.
Right. Like TikTok, the TikTok app being banned by government officials in a lot of countries.
Exactly. Yeah. So there's certainly a possibility in that direction. But in terms of like banning the like fundamental core technology, I think that would be, really hard.
Stepping back a bit from all this, like, do you think this is something to be celebrated, or is it something we should be cautious of, or does this excite you, or how do you look at this a month later?
I mean, it's exciting, and also I'm really cautious because in the past month, I've seen all kinds of narratives from both Silicon Valley and the US government for why they should ignore the core lesson of DeepSeek, which is to just start doing some real innovation and try and help us get, true progress, both in advancement of AI capabilities and environmental impacts. I've just seen like all of these justifications for why like scaling is actually still the way to go, and we still should be spending $500 billion on Stargate, and like nothing should change other than to actually move even faster because the US is now definitely on an all-out race with China. And
what are the arguments other than just pure path dependency?
So one of them is that again, like scaling is the clearest formula that we know that is predictable and works. And so if we're going to, if we've already determined that there is a Chinese company that can do this, we don't have time to waste to do other innovation. We just have to keep exploiting the formula that we know. That's one argument. Another one is like, why should we continue building $500 billion of computing infrastructure? Well, when something is made more energy efficient, there's this thing called Javon's paradox that says then more people will use it. It won't, like, the unit is more efficient, but like overall there's more energy demand because now everyone wants one. And DeepSeek will probably create, or whatever, the techniques that they have used, which we will now use on our own models, will make our models more efficient, which means more people will demand them.
Well, so we'll still use that compute anyway.
Yeah, we'll still have $500 billion worth of demand to meet. And I think there's sort of like a combination of those two arguments too, which is like, okay, we're going to incorporate all of the things that DeepSeek showed that we could do to make our models more efficient. And then we're going to pop it onto a $100 billion supercomputer. And then we're going to get AGI.
And let it rip. And then it'll be, yeah.
I'm really worried that everyone is taking sort of the wrong lesson from this moment. So in the short term, I'm quite pessimistic because also the political environment that we're in the US right now. But long term, I do think that I am optimistic because I do think that there have been some really exciting conversations happening outside of the US because of DeepSeek. Like I'm seeing, African researchers or researchers in Latin America that have suddenly realized that a game they thought they couldn't play is perhaps a game that they'll be really good at playing. Like knowing how to innovate with really, really constrained resources. And I think there will be a lot more interesting ideas starting to come from outside the US in the future that will help us kind of get to this ultimate goal, which is progress with, more sustainability and just being overall better for people.
Yeah. It's interesting. I was at that Paris AI Summit and that message certainly wasn't there. There it was all about how do we use all our any excess energy capacity we might have as a country to lure more investment to build compute centers in our countries, right? So maybe it's happening in the global south, but it's certainly not happening in the industrialized countries that are still fighting this same fight alongside US tech.
Yeah.
So what's the right lesson here then? What should we take from this experience?
The right lesson is that, we really need to have a serious conversation about what progress means and what innovation actually means. And when we think about why to build any kind of technology, whether it's AI or not, we first need to think about what we just need as a society. Like we need clean air and clean water, and we need a faster transition away from fossil fuels, and we need better healthcare, better education. We need more stability and social cohesion, and less misinformation. And if we start at that starting point and then think like, how does any technology fit into that? That is the way that we should be thinking about just building technologies and tools that serve us and make the world better. And that is exactly the opposite of what we've been doing thus far, which is like, let's just think, like what Silicon Valley has been doing is like, let's just look at the AI and decide to make the AI better. And of course, if the AI is better on these arbitrary markers that we've picked out, then it's just going to make the world a better place. And that's like totally backwards. So I think the lesson really is, it's just a reminder that we need to go back to the original roots of how innovation works and start with what we need and build from there.
And if not, we're also building spaceships to Mars. So
for just the few billionaires that can afford the ticket.
Exactly. Well, look, thanks for talking this through with me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Taylor.
Machines Like Us is produced by Paradigms in collaboration with the Globe and Mail. This episode was produced by Ramatullah Sheikh. Our senior producer is Mitchell Stewart. Our associate producer is Sequoia Kim. Our theme song is by Chris Kelly. The executive producer of Paradigms is James Millward. A special thanks to Matt Frainer and the team at the Globe and Mail. If you like the interview you just heard, please subscribe and leave a rating or a comment. It really does help us get the show to as many people as possible.